28, and this is your Wednesday video. We're going to finish up Wednesday Wars. Sad to see this would come to an end. It's been so wonderful, but perfect as we're leading into spring break next week. This will be great so that we get to just end on such a happy note. Remember, Mrs. Biggio had asked Mai Tai if maybe she could be her adopted parent, and Mai Tai was delighted. They hugged, and they're still camping. It's where we had left off. That night I lay awake. It seems that the soggy ground had sunk down and left a whole lot of rocks to poke up into me. I watched the bazillion stars amaze the sky above. I watched until they fell asleep themselves. Hey, there's some personification, right? What we're learning about this week. The stars don't fall asleep. That's giving them human characteristics. I love it. So beautiful. I watched the bazillion stars amaze the sky above. I watched until they fell asleep themselves. Half my mind on sea, half on shore, thinking about Mai Tai and Mrs. Biggio, and Lieutenant Baker coming home to Mrs. Baker, and Danny Hupfer getting ready for his bar mitzvah, and Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., and how in 5 years I'd have to register for the Vietnam draft, and how the dew was starting to soak my sleeping bag. So I was still awake when the dawn started to think about showing herself. Holland uses a lot of personification, a lot of figurative language. It's beautiful. The dawn started thinking about showing herself. That's giving her human characteristics. I promise I'll stop making these comments throughout. I just got so excited. The air was coloring everything gray, and the fog was coming up from the ground in white shreds and billows, as if the whole campsite had lifted itself up into the clouds overnight. I slipped out of my dewy sleeping bag and walked through the white and the gray to the water. When I reached it, the stream rippled happily, as if it had been waiting just for me all this time. I knelt down and lowered my palm into it, cold, frigidly cold. But I rolled up my pants and waded in. Beneath me, the rocks of the stream bed felt smooth and slick, even soft as the water rushed past, carrying itself away. Then I looked upstream. The disk of the sun had just come up, and the billows of fog had bowed to it and backed away. The river was a sudden ribbon of silvery light, flickering and sparkling and flashing, carrying the new light on its back all the way down from the high mountains. It was so bright that you couldn't see below the surface until the water was right up to you, and then it was suddenly clear and buoying me up in its rush. And it never stopped, this rush of bright water from the mountains, these flashes and chunks of light from the sun. There was so much of it to come. I didn't tell anyone about the river that morning, not even Merrill Lee. I think that if I had told Pastor McClellan, he would have said it was a vision. I think if I had told Mrs. Baker, she would have said that it was a miracle, and that all dawns were miracles. Miracles being much on her mind lately, as you can understand. I think that if I had told Shakespeare about the river, he would have said, "All this amazement can I qualify?" But he would have been wrong, since what I saw was something more beautiful than has ever been written. But I didn't tell anyone, not even Danny, who was hoping for a miracle right up to the day of his bar mitzvah. You could see him waiting for the worst to happen when he stood up in the synagogue a week later. A synagogue that was full, mostly with Hupfers. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Sidman sat near the front. Mai Tai and Merrill Lee and Heather and I sat behind a group of ancient Hupfers. I was trying to keep my borrowed yarmulke on the back of my head because I felt like it was slipping down all the time. And our parents were there too, even my father, who I guess figured that Mr. Hupfer might someday need an architect, and so he had better show up. It was sort of like an investment. He sat as far away from Mr. Kowalski as he could. We all watched as Danny pulled the prayer shawl his great-uncle had given him around his shoulders. The tassels reached below his waist. Then he wound the tefillin around his arm and across his forehead. You could see him still waiting for the worst, hoping for a miracle. Then the prayers, still waiting. Then he walked with the rabbi and Cantor back to the altar and took out the Torah. We all stood. I reached up to press down my yarmulke, and he carried the Torah back to the reading desk. The rabbi drew it from its mantle, untied the scroll, and rolled it open. A huge breath from Danny, still waiting. And then, can you believe it? The miracle came after all. He lifted one of the tassels, touched it to the scroll, and kissed it. He took the handle of the Torah in his own hands, and he began to sing. Barak et Adonai, Hey Medvorash. And everyone around us sang back. And Danny sang again, deep and steady. And he got to Barak ata Adonai Notien HaTorah, when everyone sang back just as deep and just as steady. Amen. Then Danny took a deep breath and began to read from the Torah. Okay, so maybe sometimes the real world is smiles and miracles. Right there in front of us, Danny Hupfer was no longer Danny who stuck wads of gum under his desk, or Danny who screamed out of his skull at soccer games, or Danny who ran cross-country on bloody knees and waved sweaty t-shirts. He was more than all of those things. He sang the words, and he was everyone who had sung them before him, like he was taking up his place in this huge choir. And it wasn't Miss Violet of the very spiky heels, but God himself leading the music, and you saw Danny covered with weight. Then the cantor and Danny's father stood over him and blessed him. More weight. And Danny chanted again, this time from the prophets, more weight. And then he reached into his back pocket and took out his speech, his Devar Torah. Today he said, I am become a man. And he had. You could see it afterward when he recited the blessings over the Haya, over the Chala, and over the wine, and everyone shouted, L'chaim, to life. Danny had become a man. You could see him take up his place, and he was smiling and crying too. After the service, my parents and Heather decided not to stay for the party, already starting in the reception hall. When they asked if I wanted a ride, I told them I would walk home instead, but I went to the parking lot with them anyway. As he unlocked the car, my father said, I bet you're glad you don't have to go through something like that. I guess I am, I said. What do you mean, I guess I am, he said. Would you want to stand up there with all that stuff all over you and chant at everyone? It was a whole lot more than chanting at everyone, I said. Let's get in the car, said my mother. No, said my father. He put his arms up on top of the station wagon's roof. I'd like to know what Hulling thought was a whole lot more. My stomach got tight. He became a man, I said. You think that's how you become a man, by chanting a few prayers? You think you become a man by getting a job as an architect? My father straightened up. That's exactly how you become a man, he said. You get a good job and you provide for your family. You hang on and you play for keeps. That's how it works. I really do think we should get in the car, said my mother. I don't think so, I said to my father. It's not just about a job. It's more. It has to do with choosing for yourself. And you didn't even have to go to California to figure all that out, said my father. So who are you, Holling? I felt Heather looking at me, and somehow, I don't know how, I thought of Bobby Kennedy, who could have made all the difference. I don't know yet, I said finally. I'll let you know. What a barrel of mumbo-jumbo, said my father. He got into the station wagon and slammed the door. My mother blew me a kiss, really, and then she got in too. And my sister got in last of all. She was smiling. I could hardly breathe. When they drove away, I went back inside Temple Bethel, where the sounds of the miracle were still loud. Danny was still smiling, and it wasn't just because Mr. Goldman had brought huge trays of brown light perfect cream puffs. He couldn't stop smiling, and after a while I couldn't either, especially once the dancing started and Marilee took my hand, and even more especially after Marilee said, You look different. And I said, Maybe it's the yarmulke. And she said, No, it's something else. Marilee. Can the world buy such a jewel? It was when I had gone to find her a Coke that I saw Mrs. Baker standing alone beside a pile of sugared strawberries. She was holding one in her hand, smiling too. Now, I know that you're not supposed to talk to a teacher outside of school activities. It's a rule that probably no one has ever broken, but I decided to break it anyway. Do you think Lieutenant Baker will really be home in time for strawberries? I said. Mrs. Baker, smiling Mrs. Baker, did not look away from the strawberry. I'm sure of it, she said. Now I smiled. Do teachers always know the future? Always, she said. Shall I tell you yours? Standing there in the music of the bar mitzvah party, feeling the weight of what had happened in the synagogue, I saw again the glittering stream with its light rushing toward me. Don't tell me, I said. But how do you know? She looked away from the strawberry and at me. Do you remember Don Pedro standing alone at the end of the play? I nodded. Claudio has Hero, and they'll be fine. Benedict has Beatrice, and they'll be fine. Everyone else has everyone else, and they'll all be fine. And the only one who's left alone is Don Pedro, and they all go off to dance and leave him behind. And they don't even remember that he's the one who has to deal with the traitor tomorrow, or that he hasn't got anyone. That's right, said Mrs. Baker. And maybe his whole country will split into pieces, and he doesn't have any idea what's going to happen to him. Great comedy, I said. Comedy isn't about being funny, said Mrs. Baker. Yeah, we've talked about this before. A comedy is about characters who dare to know that they may choose a happy ending after all. That's how I know. Suppose you can't see it. That's the daring part, said Mrs. Baker. So you think Don Pedro ended up all right, I said. I think he became a man who brought peace and wisdom to his world, because he knew about war and folly. I think that he loved greatly because he had seen what lost love is, and I think he came to know too that he was loved greatly. He looked at the strawberry in her hands. But I thought you didn't want me to tell you your future. The music started again. A quick ring dance. Danny Hupfer was going to dance with Mrs. Biggio, and Mai Tai was doubled over laughing. Miss Sidman had stepped into the ring beside Doug Swideck, who didn't look all that happy. The Kowalskis and the Hupfers had come in together, Mrs. Hupfer and Mrs. Kowalski giggling, and in their stocking feet, since she can't dance in high heels, and Mary Lee, everyone was laughing and jostling to their places. I needed to go find mine. L'chaim, I said to Mrs. Baker, and she smiled, not a teacher's smile. Chrysanthemum, she said. 11 days later, on Wednesday, Lieutenant Tybalt Baker came home. It was the day that President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that the Marines were abandoning Kashana. I was at the airport, me and Danny and Mai Tai and Mary Lee and Doug and the whole class. Standing. Sorry. I will be able to get through this. Standing on the tarmac when the military plane landed, we all held boxes of sweet strawberries. And I guess you want to know what Mrs. Baker did when Lieutenant Baker came out of the plane. And I guess you want to know what Lieutenant Baker did when he saw Mrs. Baker on the tarmac. But toads, beetles, bats, if you can't figure that out for yourself, then a southwest blow on ye and blister ye all over. Because let me tell you, it was a happy ending. Okay. I love happy endings. So awesome. Holly was able to stand up to his dad a little bit. Hope their relationship gets better. Might not, though. But like Mrs. Baker says, Holly can choose for himself, and he's going to become a great man who makes a difference in the world because he's seen the other side, kind of. He's seen how families shouldn't be, and so he knows what kind of family he wants to have. And yeah, he just has learned so much from Shakespeare. There's a sequel to this book. It's called OK for Now. It's a companion to The Wednesday Wars. OK for Now by Gary Schmidt. And I think that would be fun to check out. I'm going to go see if I can add it to my summer reading list. Have a great spring break. We've got one more book that we might start after the break. Depends on how long it is. We don't have much time left. So we'll catch you in in a few weeks. See you then. Thank you.